All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be going into an introductory week or module over the full stack application or process. And we're going to be starting off with our HTML and CSS today. First, we'll get an overlook of the whole enchilada. What exactly is a server? How does a front end look like? And what does it look like when it has some sort of responsive web design? And then we'll take a look at some sample data. From there, we'll actually start our lecture on HTML, starting with what is HTML. I always talk about how everything inside of web development or programming is just boxes inside of boxes. And that especially relates to HTML or when you're designing a website. So I'll go ahead and take the time to break down this Amazon website into a drawing of boxes inside boxes. Then we'll be covering structure tags. I'm not going to read off this massive list. After structure tags, we'll be going over body tags, and that says, excuse me, these are our content tags. Moving on to element tags, we'll be covering HTML forms, their different methods for submission, anchor tags, list, image tags, making a table within HTML, some HTML semantics, such as header, nav, and main. These are all just divs in disguise. And then we'll talk about some of the connecting script tags. From there, we'll knock into our CSS lecture, where we'll be covering what is CSS, some of the CSS basics, the style attribute, writing CSS within an HTML document, the different selectors and their hierarchy, linking a CSS sheet, the box model, and then we'll talk about responsive web design a bit so that everybody can start looking into it. And then lastly, at the end of our lecture, we'll go a little bit into the prerequisites of ensuring that your machine's PostgreSQL is running properly, because we'll be diving into database management here shortly. All right, that is our basic overview. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? Okay, great. Doesn't look like there are any questions, so let's start with our overview. So the full stack application, all right? And here we have Amazon.com. I feel like it's one of our greatest examples about how everything is just boxes. If we look at Amazon, this is just our front end framework, right? And their front end framework has a little bit of information that's permanent and a lot of it that's coming in from somewhere else. Now, what do I mean by that? This very top header likely only changes depending on your location, but the design and skeleton of this framework or this site that we're looking at remains the same, right? If any one of you on your actual machine go to Amazon.com, you could probably see Amazon. I should probably figure out a way to block that out in the recording. And then you could see there's a search bar and a couple of other things up here that belong to the search bar, but they're going to be continuous to everyone. Now, what changes? I know that a couple of weeks ago, or at least last cohort, when I did this lecture, the boys' new episodes weekly wasn't here. Right, that wasn't part of this slideshow. Neither was this multicolored lamps there. None of this Father's Day gift information was currently located. Pretty much nothing on the slideshow was there a couple of months ago. And I actually distinctively remember that the last time I taught this lecture was around the time that the new season of Invincible came out. So that was the header that they had up in their website was, hey, the new season of Invincible was out. Okay, great. Now, how does this information even populate into this site, right? There's no way that there's someone manually going into this website, manually changing each one of these slides over and over again, almost on a daily basis, or every time Amazon wants something changed, that they're going into each one of these squares, changing each individual image. It just doesn't sound like a very smart way of working, right? The skeleton seems rather rational. If we take a look at this card, I'm gonna call it a card, but this white square here that says shops for Father's Day gifts or shop Father's Day gifts has 4 icons inside of it, and at the very bottom it says shop all. Okay. Well, if we look at the remaining white squares in this site, it doesn't look like there's much of a change, right? They're all white squares with one specific header, 4 separate icons inside of it, each one of them having their own title. And then at the very bottom, having a shop all or some sort of anchor tag that will link me to some new information. And it repeats itself, right? So there's the top 3 categories. Here's one again. Here's another. This one looks a little bit different. So more than likely, there's some sort of conditional rendering happening here, deciding whether it will show the 4 squares or show one massive square, depending on how many categories they have inside of it. And then even this bar down here, although it's not the same as these white cards up above, it's the same for the row below it. All right. I continue to scroll down and now I'm back to my 4 cards. But again, none of this information, it wouldn't be smart to change all this information manually. There's got to be a more dynamic way to do it. So HTML provides me my skeleton, the part of my code that will remain consistent regardless of the data that is being passed into it, right? My skeleton. Now, where does my bones and my muscle and everything come from? Well, that comes from a backend framework. So I'm not saying this is exactly how it works, but more than likely what's going on here is as soon as you type in Amazon.com and you press enter on that bar and this starts rendering, an API call or some sort of communication gets sent out from my HTML template. My HTML template says, hey, I'm about to render, and I'm about to render all of my body. Now, there's a specific section in HTML called the head, which we'll talk about here shortly, that takes care of connecting any information that we need before starting to render HTML. So now this skeleton doesn't look bare bones, right? There's some sort of styling going on into it. We can see a couple of different displays happening down here. Some things are in a row, some things are in a grid format. So why exactly is that, or where is this coming from? Because this isn't from HTML. Well, this is coming from CSS, right? So in that header portion, before it even starts rendering my skeleton, it says, well, I need to load all of the styling that you have provided. So it grabs all of the styling, reads it, and it's good to go. All right, the styling has been loaded. I'm ready to start loading some skeleton code. But what about information? How do I know how to fill in each one of these squares? Well, we're not going to have that same information lapped in with our front-end framework. Instead, it's going to send out some sort of API call to our backend framework. All right, so this API call is going to get sent. And for example, as far as what an API may look like, we're going to take a look at the Pokey API. So a call is going to get sent to some sort of API framework. More than likely, in this case, is going to be something along the lines of amazon.com/API/ some sort of version, and then /products or homepage. And what that's going to return is it's going to return a ridiculous amount of JSON data. Now, this JSON data may seem useless at times, but this JSON data, what it's going to do is it's going to work with JavaScript in order to render each one of these squares. So let's take a look at a little bit of an example data here. I have this data.json, and I have it as far as categories, right? Well, categories may be something like shop for Father's Day gifts. And then inside of it, it may have something like products. And then some sort of loop may be happening saying, hey, for each one of these products inside of this category, I want you to render a square. And then it renders a square, filling it in by title, naming the price, maybe a description, and then an image. Here we can see that all it's using is an image and then a price. And it seems to have some sort of conditional rendering, some logic to be able to render, hey, this is all under $10, this is under $20, deals, etc. Right? And it continues going down. none of this is actually being built by hand one by one. It's actually being reproduced from some sort of API call that JavaScript can easily iterate through and talk to the HTML template in order to create this content. So let's go about the flow of information here. So we have three separate entities working together. All right, so my first one, it's going to be my front end, which we'll be covering today. Since we'll be covering today, it's important for us to know that our front end typically depends on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without talking about different frameworks. We'll need an entity of a backend server, which we'll be talking about later on as far as how that functions and how to build our API. And then we need to be able to communicate to a database, because all of this information here can't just exist within some sort of API call or some program. It needs to maintain some sort of persistency. So that's where a database comes in. So communication, I go ahead and travel to Amazon.com, right? I go to my front end. Well, when I go to my front end, the very first thing that populates is that call to my backend framework. So I make a call, API call. Front end talks to backend, says, hey, I need some info. I'm gonna make that small here. So that API call gets sent, talks to the backend, says, I need some info. Well, this request is going to specify what kind of info they'll need. The backend will then grab that request and say, oh, this is the information you need. Let me try to grab it out of the database. So then the backend framework will speak to our database, say, hey, I need this specific content. The database will then return said content to our backend framework as an SQL query. Our backend framework will then format it and turn it into something that JavaScript can work with. And then our backend framework will simply return that over to our front end, so that our front end can utilize JavaScript to render some information on the screen. So this is the whole full stack lifecycle. Does anyone have any questions about the quick overview of the full stack lifecycle? All right, I don't see any questions on X-ray questions. There does seem quite a bit of students that are, oh, I apologize, that is not true. All right, well, now that we have this information, we know how this full stack lifecycle works. Let's start breaking down Amazon.com into what it really is, right? So now, if we take a look at Amazon.com, it may seem a little bit overwhelming, right? It may seem like there's a lot of content here. You can't really replicate this, X, Y, and Z. Well, in reality, all I see here is maybe 2 or 3 divisions and then a repetitiveness of rows. Now, let's break it down. So the first one, and let's scroll down here. Here's our web page. All right, in our web page, and I take a look at Amazon.com, the very top part is going to be my header. Inside of said header, there's a couple of constant information, but I can tell that the one thing that's distinctive is 1, my search bar, and 2, oh, let me close that out so I don't have it, my nav bar. So here's my nav bar, and then I have a tiny search bar right on top. Everything else is just a bunch of buttons. Don't necessarily need to worry about said buttons. So I'm just gonna make this tiny square here for a button group, right? Okay, so that takes care of the very top part of Amazon.com. The next thing that I see is we have some sort of overlay or carousel that has a couple of images within it. right? And then these images can go left or right. So let me go ahead and add that in there. So there's my images, there's my cursor. And then finally I see a row of squares. So we have a row that's overlapping. So I'm going to put my cursor on a different color here. I'm going to make it gold so that we can see that it's overlapping. I have a row that's overlapping that has a series of squares inside of it. And inside of each one of these squares, there's another 4 squares. And actually, let me make my life easier here. And that's that's the actual skeleton of what we're looking at. We just have a couple of divisions with a little bit of different content, right? This is the skeleton and what I want to create. The guts and the information that goes inside of it isn't HTML, but it's actually JavaScript and CSS working together to fill in the body. Does anyone have any questions regarding the breakdown of the skeleton of HTML at this point? Okay, great. If no one has any questions, let's start getting into some code. So now that we have our overlook of the full stack application, let's talk about what is HTML. Does anyone have any sort of prior experience or a guess as to what HTML stands for?
Hypertext markup language.
Go ahead, Eric.
I was about to say the same thing as I think Mikhail, hypertext markup language.
All right, hypertext markup language. So we have our hypertext markup language, and I'm not going to go too much into the story of hypertext because we'll be covering it in a future lecture. Essentially, how the internet all started, it was just text with links to other text files over and over again, right? So that's where the hypertext comes from. When I click on something, it sends me to another site. And it continues going that way. And it was first created for a college. It was created for them to have a consistent way of keeping track of records and sharing scientific research with other educational organizations. But obviously it evolved. And now what we're working with is HTML, which has capabilities to have images, to create content, to run games, to have GIFs. It has a ridiculous amount of capabilities, right? And we all actually have a lot of experience with HTML. We just don't realize it. For example, I'm sure people here remember MySpace. MySpace used to have you write literal HTML into your profile in order to decorate it or create different components within your profile. All right, so let's go into some HTML document structure tags here. So the first one is the doc type. Let me go ahead and open it up here. Oh, hello. I have my caps on. I'm going to go ahead and create a file. I'm going to name this index.html. And typically you want to name it index if it's your actual homepage. That's the actual, I want to say, convention for your homepage of your project. When we get into React, you'll see an index HTML, and I want to emphasize everything that gets rendered by the browser when it comes to an actual site is HTML being rendered. So I'm going to run that information, and I see index HTML open up here on my project. Now, how do I get this index HTML to load up inside of my browser? Now, there's a couple of different ways to do it. You could actually launch an index HTML file straight into the internet. have your own host it and have other people be able to visit it. That's not some information that we're going to be covering today, but you can definitely look into it. Today, what we're going to be covering is an extension called Live Server. Now, why would I utilize Live Server over all of the different methods to actually render this index HTML template onto my browser? Well, Live Server offers a very specific component of hot reload. Now, hot reload means that every time there is a change within my file and that file gets saved, what Live Server does is it actually pushes information into my browser without my browser having to request it. So typically what would happen is my browser would have to either request the updated information. Well, what Live Server is doing is it says, hey, there was a change. Here's the information. And it forces it into my browser without it requesting it. All right, so here's the Live Server extension. I'm going to go ahead and install it. I already have it installed. So once I have it installed, there's two different methods for doing this. One, I'm going to make sure that I'm within the correct directory. I am. I can see index.html there. So you could either right click on the file and you can see the option at the very top says open with Live Server, or at the very bottom of your screen, there's going to be this go live and it tells you, hey, click to run the Live Server. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that button. We can see that a Live Server has now opened up. So here we go. Live reload is not possible without a header or a body tag. That's fair. We'll go into this here shortly. But we'll see that a server is started at port 62049. So we haven't really talked too much about servers. So what exactly does this mean? Well, within my machine, as we talked about earlier, I'm going to need 3 separate frameworks talking to one another. And these frameworks can't exist within the same port. If they exist within the same port, their data would be conflicting with one another, and that's not what we want. So what our machine actually is, again, is a bunch of boxes inside of boxes. Our machine is a massive land of ports. The way that I like to think about them is kind of like a block of real estate, right? There's a whole block of communities, and all of these communities are up for sale, but they can only be occupied by one family at a time. I mean, I guess that's not necessarily true for everyone, but ideally you would want only one family at a time occupying this, right? So our front end should live within one of these ports. Our back end should live within some sort of separate port. It doesn't really matter which one it is, as long as they're able to communicate to each other. And then finally, our database should be running within a different port. All of these servers are running, but their information gets isolated to each one of their frameworks because they're running on separate ports. And we'll talk about the communication within them later on this week. But as of right now, when I take a look at my server, I can see here that a port within my machine is occupied. The port within my machine that's occupied is 62049. So if I take a look at this square, what would go in here is 62049. It's the address within my machine, or the port within my machine, where my front end framework is being rendered. And if I take a look at this tab here, we can see that I have 127.0.0.1. Where did that come from? Does anyone know? Go ahead.
The IP address?
Go ahead, Daniel.
If I'm correct, is that the IP address?
That's close, right? That would be typically where our IP address is located. If I look up here, we have our TL draw. But what we actually have here is the location where this file is coming from. 127.0.0.1 means that this is our machine. It stands for our local machine or our local host. So our machine at port 62049 is rendering an empty file. All right. Any questions about how this live server is rendering HTML into my browser at this point? Good. There aren't any questions, so let's start kicking off our content of our lecture. The first thing that we're going to be covering today is going to be our doc type. So how does this browser know what exactly is being rendered? If I just type in hello, what will my browser do? Let's see, I'm going to refresh this. So it's rendering hello, but let's take a look at this message. It's saying, hey, live server is having an issue. There's no head or body tag. Let me take a look at my browser. There is no head or body tag, but if I take a look at my browser, if I right click and click on inspect, I can see the elements that are being rendered by my browser. Well, my browser is saying there's an HTML tag, a head tag, and a body. I never provided any of this information. So what my browser is actually doing is it's trying to help me out. It's saying, okay, well, you didn't give me this info, but I know you're trying to render some sort of HTML because of the file that you sent me. So I'm going to try to fill in the blank here for you. All right, it's rendering it for me, but it shouldn't be doing it if it didn't have the correct tags, right? This is just Google Chrome being a user-friendly interface, trying to help me out. So let's actually help Google Chrome and tell it what we want it to do. So the very first tag that I'm going to send here is going to be doctype HTML. So a browser is going to be looking for the information there to understand that what I'm actually trying to render will follow the HTML convention of HTML tags. And that will also help VS Code understand some of the different keyboard shortcuts that I'll be using within this file. So there's my doctype HTML. It communicates with the browser grabs the file, looks at the doctype, says, this is the type of doctype you're trying to render, it's HTML. Now there's other types of doctypes that you can pass to the browser. That's why it's important that we specify this is HTML. Now the next version of my content here will be, well, an HTML tag. And this is going to open up all of the information that will fall within HTML. Now everything gets nested. Again, everything is boxes within boxes. Inside of my HTML tag, I need two tags. I need my head, and I also need my content or my body. So these are my two types of tags. So now I'm going to write something here. I'm going to say this is head, and I'm going to write body. Well, let me refresh the page and see what we have there. All right, so I have head body being rendered by my browser. Now again, why is that showing head body in my browser if I have head within the head, right? I expected to not be able to see head. All of the information that will be within my head tags shouldn't be interacting with it in my browser. Well, if I take a look at my HTML elements being rendered by my browser, I can see that my head is empty and my body tag actually has both head and body. So again, my browser grabbed the index HTML template and it's trying to help me out. It's saying, hey, you don't have this in the correct format. Let me help you out by fixing it. So let's actually put this into perspective, right? Let's tell my browser what I'm trying to do. Well, there's a couple of different tags that go inside of head. Inside of head, we have the title, meta, and the link tag. The link tag is quite literally used to link other files, right? Such as CSS style sheets. We'll be looking at that later on this afternoon. But we're going to be covering meta and title within my head. Now, when I take a look at these other sites like Amazon.com, I can see that it says spend less, smile more. And then TL Draw has that TL Draw being written on their tab. Well, how does that get written on their tab? Well, that gets added there from the title tag. Here I can put X-ray. And by putting X-ray within the title tag, I can now see that my tab of my browser says X-ray. I have just changed the tab title. I can change the icon there if I wanted to. We're not going to be demonstrating that today, but know that you do have the capability to create your icon for your specific site and include it in your tab. Now, the next thing that we'll be covering will be the meta tag. So what is the meta tag used for? The meta tag is used to describe things to the browser such as, hey, maybe we want to utilize a different set of characters. Maybe we have something like a different language that we want to utilize. All of that gets specified into the meta tag. I could never remember the correct syntax for the meta tag. And I'm going to actually demonstrate to everyone a nice keyboard shortcut to render the majority of this information. So if I get rid of all of this, it all goes away, and I place in an exclamation mark. So now when I have this one exclamation mark, I can press tab. And by pressing tab on that exclamation mark, all of this index HTML template gets rendered for me. So we can see we have my HTML tag again, or my doc types saying that this is going to be an HTML. I then have my HTML tag down below specifying the language that I'm going to be working with. In this case, it's English. I have a head section that has a meta tag for the char sets that I'm going to be looking at. I have a separate meta tags, and this one is controlling the scale at which my design is going to apply. So it says, hey, I want everything to be in reference to the viewport, and I want the content of this body or the content of this HTML script to match the width of the device width with a 1-to-1 initial scale. From there, you could zoom in or zoom out, but it's just matching content with the device width. And that's how you get it matching with different types of monitors, right? For example, the monitor that I'm currently using right now is one of those curved monitors, and it's pretty large. So the fact that everything is matching to a 1-to-1 scale is coming from this initial scale. And then I'll go ahead and change that document back to X-ray. All right. So now I have my initial template. I'm going to go ahead and format that a little bit. So here we have doc type, HTML. My head is now complete, and I have an empty body, which actually let's just put body in there so that we can see some content show up in our live server. Okay, and now we can see that our live server is providing us an exact replica of our HTML template. At this point, does anyone have any questions over everything I've covered so far? Go ahead, Momo.
Yeah, when you said we make the meta to make the template, the part of the when it make this command to fit your browser to any screen, you mean different screen, like when we open it from the phone, when we open it from the laptop, when we open it from the iPad, it's gonna be fit, or that's what you mean?
It's not necessarily going to be fit magically, but what it's going to match is the sizing of scale. So for example, if I say, hey, I want to utilize 10 pixels for font size, right? Like I want each one of my letters to cover 10 pixels in height. Well, a pixel that is rendered by my laptop may be a lot smaller than a pixel that is rendered by a monitor, right? Or by my phone. So what it tries to do is it matches the scale of those pixels as much as possible. Does that make sense, Momo? Okay, I see
Yes,
it.
thank you. Yeah.
All right, Chris.
Yes, my question is for the address you put in your browser. Where did you find the IP? Is that the default IP? What did you call it again? IP address or not an IP address?
Yeah. So here up above, the first couple of numbers on the left-hand side,
Mhm.
that's just referencing your local machine.
Gotcha.
So that's always going to be 127.0.1, or you could type in local. That will be the same one, right? What follows on here after this colon in the middle, and I'm not sure if you could see that. Let me zoom in. Maybe that will help. Oh, that only zoomed in on the browser. It doesn't zoom in up top.
I can see it.
Okay, so there's that colon. After that colon, what it's doing is it's specifying the port. So it's saying, hey, within this machine that's here, I want you to run the information that's running on port 62049. So if I go to localhost colon, oh, hello. Localhost colon 62049. It takes me to the same information as 127.0.0.
But how did you know to typed in 62049? Like, is that in the index file or?
So if I come back to VS Code where I'm running that live server,
Oh,
down
I see.
it tells me that it's occupying port 62049.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Any other questions? Oh, Brandon?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Chris's question. Live server does it automatically for you, so you really don't. In all honesty, you don't have to remember that. You can just could you turn it off and turn it back on again, Francisco?
Absolutely.
Through VS Code.
Turn it off, turn it back on, then it opens it.
Right. It takes you right to it. So that's just, if you want to understand it and stuff, look into it for sure. But in all honesty, you press that button and it does it for you.
Cody?
Thank you.
Is this something? I know you said that the ports for each, the front end and the back end in the SQL database, is that something we're going to have to keep track of when programming for that part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So later on, once we're actually communicating between each one of these, you'll have to actually know what ports are taking care of what information. Depending on what kind of deployment system you're using, you may have to specify the port connection. If your backend server, which is working as an API, if you want it to be isolated and only allow communication with specific origins, you have to tell it the origin and port in which to expect that communication from. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, it does. So you could force a port, right? So like if you have a firewall or something.
If you can force support, what do you mean by force support? You mean
Yes,
I
you can assign
specify-
different ports in most
give me a
cases.
second, Rich. Can you ask your question again, Cody?
Yeah, I think it's like, so if you always want to use 62049 for the front end, right? And then you can just assign that and then you can firewall the rest of the other ports out. So it only works on that one.
Yes, that's correct. You can definitely specify the port in which you want things running in.
Thank you.
All right, Momo.
Sorry, another question. Yeah. How did you install the live server?
How did I what?
How did you install the live server?
Yeah, so if I go over to extensions and I type in live server, it's going to populate.
Okay, thank you.
Works. All right. Oh, one more question. Go ahead, Erica.
I know we're going over the specifically the coding part, but are we going to look at SEO optimization in the terms of content and meta tags too?
No, we're not soon. That may happen during the React project, but that's more of a more in-depth concept that we don't touch here. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Moving forward, so now that we have our body tags, we're able to understand how to build our HTML template. Let's go into some of our content tags. So in our content tags, we have our body, H1, paragraph tag, and our break tag. Well, how does that work? What is an H1 tag? Well, if I go over to Amazon.com, I can see that there's pretty much some text that's bigger than others, right? Some of it is bolder by default. Some of it may be bolder because of something they did themselves. And I could even take a look at their code by doing the same thing that I did to my own server, right? I can type in inspect, and I can see from the very top to the very bottom, all of the different things that they're running, their different divisions, their divisions with different text inside of it and different scales. So let's go ahead and actually run a little bit of text manipulation inside of our own. Our H1 tag is typically used as the header of our actual site. So let's say that I want an H1 tag. In this H1 tag, I want to say, this is X-ray. And let's talk about Platoon text store. All right, so there you go. Now our X-ray Platoon has a text store. And that's all happening from our H1 tag. We can see how the text changed, right? Our H1 tags go all the way up to 6. I'm not going to demonstrate each one of them. But what I will demonstrate is our H1, H3, and H6 so that we can take a look at it. Now, I don't know about everybody else, but when I learned this kind of took me for a trip because I would expect that as the numbers get bigger, the text would get bigger. Well, it actually works the opposite direction. As the numbers get bigger in header tags, the text gets smaller.
But that makes sense because they're subheaders.
Exactly. But that makes sense because it's talking about the layering of this information. Just like we have boxes inside of boxes, we wouldn't want each one of those things to be sharing the same H1 tag, right? Or to be sharing the same header. So this number is referencing the level of depth that it's going into. So our very top layer out here would have an H1 tag. Right? These next two layers may or may not hold an H2 tag. Inside of this third box down here, we may or may not have an H3 tag. Then inside of these boxes, H4s, then H5s, and H6, and so on. It's like one of those Russian dolls, right? Every time you open one, there's another one inside of it, and it just keeps getting smaller. That's all we're seeing here. All right. So there's our H tags. The next thing we're going to cover is going to be our paragraph tags. So inside of my paragraph tag, I can have any sort of text. And a shortcut for writing random text inside of VS Code, if you type in lorem ipsum will actually just provide a bunch of random text. And I think it's in Latin. I'm not sure if it actually says something, but you could keep typing it over and over again.
Lorem ipsum is based off of the old printing presses, and it was just it is old Latin, but it was used for spacing and for we use it now in HTML just because it's part of the old like printing and
It's used all over design for anything that's print too.
correct. Yeah, exactly. And it just comes from like way back in the day.
So here's our information. Then we have all of our lorem text, right? Which is just a bunch of random text put together. And we can see it all within our paragraph tags. Well, let's take a look at a bit of a difference between our paragraph tag and what we have here in our HTML document. Now in my HTML document, I can see that there's a couple of line breaks, right? There's supposed to be some sort of indentation happening in a couple of different spots, but that indentation isn't happening on the right-hand side. It's all coming in all together. Now, this information is all coming in together, and that's because when the browser is actually reading the HTML template, it reads it from left to right, right? It's just going through content. It doesn't account for white space unless I specifically tell it to account for white space. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if I put a bunch of enters between the H1 and my paragraph tag, and I refresh my browser, nothing changed. And if I take a look at what my browser is actually rendering, we can see that all of that white space that I've added is gone. All right, it's just going from top to bottom, left to right, and it has just one specific set of content. It doesn't care about the white space that I'm providing it. So how do I fix that? How do I tell it to break a line? Well, we're going to use the BR tag, which stands for break. And it is a self-closing tag. So here we are going to use it again, BR. Boom. All right. So now we can actually see some white space, right? There is my first break right after this word. I'm not going to try to say it because I'm not going to be able to. And then there's another break right after X. Yep, that word as well, right? Well, the BR tag stands for break. What it does is it creates a line break wherever it renders, and it starts this continuous of the information into a new line, right? Now, what's unique about the break is that typically what you would see is something along these lines. An opening tag, and then a closing tag. Now you can see that this is also acceptable, all right? We have two line breaks. So one's happening here, and then it seems like it's reading it as two other instances of the line break, which isn't right. So it's creating some really unexpected behavior. And that's because the browser identifies the break tag as a self-closing tag. Rather than having an opening tag and a closing tag, because this is not supposed to have content within it, all it is a self-closing tag. It is created, and at the same time it is created, it is then closed. All right, does anyone have any questions about the H1 tag, the paragraph tag, or the break tag? Good, there aren't any questions. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go ahead and stop the lecture at this point. We do have retro in 10 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and. All right, welcome back, everyone. Right before we left, we finished talking about our break tag, and we were about to dive into some element tags. So let's go ahead and pick right up. So our element tags, what exactly is an element tag? Well, an element tag is just something that holds content within it. Now, this is just a few examples of the element tags. There is a ton out there. But all they do is they alter information and help you divide information in a more consistent way. So, for example, let's say that I had an introduction to my information. Well, I may have a couple of lorem ipsums inside of a division tag, right? Now, in this division tag, you'll notice that my division tag, not only did it create a break, but it also created some gaps between my current div and my next paragraph tag. Now, I didn't write any breaks, so where is this coming from? Well, luckily our browsers will usually come with a little bit of a description as to what each element tag comes built in with. So if I click on this div and I take a look at the right-hand side of my browser, I can see I have a div, then I see these these curly brackets. And inside of these curly brackets, I see, hey, this is in a display block. I never specified that styling. It just comes built in with a division. Now a display block, if I hover over it, we can see that it takes up a block of my display, right? It's quite literally a rectangle going from left to right on my screen. And same thing over the division tag. If I hover over the division, or sorry, the P tag, if I hover over the paragraph tag, you can see that that also has a display block that we see on the right-hand side. There's my display block, but it also comes with some built-in margins. You can see that there's a margin on top and bottom, and there we can see the margin highlighted in yellow to the top and the bottom elements. All right. I'm gonna kind of go through these in more of a checklist style rather than a demonstration style. That has been our division tag. The next one that we're gonna show is span. Now, span doesn't really have any behavior to it, but it is good for isolating unique text. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say I want this NECU to be in a span tag, right? And inside of this span tag, maybe I'm going to apply some styling. Well, you'll see that this NECU, although it is within a span tag, you never really see it. You never see the division. The NECU is there. It's located on my screen, and it's been separated from everything. But no styling came with it. I'm just simply isolating either a line of text, a specific element, or one single letter at a time. Typical thing that I've seen span tags used for, when you create some sort of banner where each letter is more of like a rainbow shape, you utilize the span tag to grab each individual letter, give them each their own ID and maybe their own attributes that you can use to access each one of those letters. And then you utilize those classes and IDs that you gave those letters to create a design that will mutate the display of each letter so that it creates that rotation or that fan element. So that's a typical use for a span tag. Next, we have strong. I'm going to go ahead and put the strong tag here at the end of aqua. So I can put strong. And now we can see that Quay, I thought it was aqua, but Quay is now bold. That is what my strong tag will do. At the same time that my strong tag will create that illusion, my EM tag will write a bunch of text, italicize. EM stands for emphasize. So this is my emphasized text. All right. Finally, we see the U tag. The U is for underlining. So if I wanted to underline some text, I can also do that. So now we got some text that has been underlined. We can see it show up as well within my elements that are being rendered by my browser. And then last but not least, we got the anchor tag, but we won't be covering the anchor tag until we get to that portion of our lesson. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding any of these element tags? Go ahead, Daniel.
Just to reiterate, so division tag is to divide blocks of words, and the span tag is to sort of separate a word from a list of words. They're just tags.
Yeah, so we'll go into it here. Let's see. So when I did this TL draw of the Amazon.com site, each one of these boxes is represented by a division. All right, so each one of these is a division. If there was a unique set of characters, let me see, within Amazon that I wanted to grab or mutate, you know, they have a really simple website, actually. It doesn't seem like they utilize that very much. But if there was some sort of rainbow logo, or maybe I wanted this here, this Father's Day gifts to be any specific text, and it wasn't just a PDF, because that's just an image in the background. I would actually grab that with a span tag and separate it from the rest of my text. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right, any other questions? All right, I don't see anything on X-ray questions. Moving on now. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is going to be our HTML forms and inputs. So now a form, how does that work? All right, and at this point, let's try to kind of design our website the same way that Amazon is located. So let's create a form here. All right, so now I have a form, but my form is currently empty. There's a little bit of behavior that comes with the form tag. If I take a look at my browser one more time, we can see that the form is also in display block. It has no margin. So here's my form. Currently, there's nothing in it, so it's not occupying any space. But I can place a couple of different input elements into a form. So here I can do input type, and let's go with text. All right, so that gives me the ability to do some text. And let's do more input here. All right, so there's a couple of inputs, I apologize. And that's going to be to demonstrate different elements. So now we can see that we have a button type. If you have a input type button, you can set a value and say hello. And now you can see that my button now says hello. You could do a couple of other things with the text. You can have something like a placeholder. Enter your name. And that will hover saying, hey, I want you to enter your name. I can say that I want this to be a color. And this will actually allow me to select a color within my browser and give me back the RGB spectrum of said color. Let's see, what other inputs are there? There's file. Let me see. I'm trying to auto-populate some stuff and it's not really giving me the option. Here we go. There's checkbox. And finally, another useful one. There's email. All right, so we can see all of the each one of these individual things. We can have something like a label be added as well. So I can have a label for my box. And then I just have to give this checkbox a property of name box. And there you go. We can see our label being populated for our checkbox. I can choose a file. You can see that when I click it, it populates a couple of files. Oh, wow. Okay. I want to cancel. We have our entire form. All right. Now, a very specific type of input is an input type submit. So I'm going to change that button and change it for a submit type. You'll see that it still remained as a button, but there's a little bit of a difference now. Let's pay attention to what's happening up here. I'm currently within my local host within index.html. Well, when I click on this hello button, I get this question mark up here. Well, let's see what's happening. I'm gonna run a couple of names here. I'm gonna go ahead and put that's my name, that's my submit, name, file. We have a box. And let's do a name email. All right, now there are a couple of attributes that we can go into. Let me break this down so far. All right, so currently I'm within index HTML. When I put Francisco in here and I click on hello, we'll notice something happened to my URL. All of those names for those different input types that I provided to the form are now appearing within my URL. They are appearing as parameters. We can see that name actually holds the content of what I typed into the form. File is empty because I didn't select one, and my email is also empty because I didn't place one in. If I put Avila, and then I come over and I say hello@gmail.com, and then I click on my box and I submit, we'll see that name now says Avila. My file was never selected. The box was on, meaning it was checked. The email said hello@gmail.com. All of my parameters that are being passed within the form are being registered by index.html and given to the browser so that I could grab them from the browser and conduct some sort of behavior. We're not going to talk about how to work with forms just yet. We're going to be covering actual form submission handling later on. But it's important that you start looking into forms since they are such a vital part of web development. Does anyone have any questions regarding forms? Okay, good. The next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be our anchor tags. So now our anchor tags, if I come down below here and I open up an anchor tag, well, an anchor tag has an href attribute. And you'll notice that my anchor tag, oh, it doesn't like that. I wonder why. And let's say this is a link. So here's my href. This is a link. It doesn't take me anywhere. Just takes me back to my same location. Well, let's say I wanted it to take me to Amazon.com. Right? I'm going to go ahead and type in HTTPS. It might be simpler if I just grab it from up there. All right, that's a little much. So I'm just going to have it go to Amazon.com. All right, well, I come back over to X-Ray, refresh it. Now, when I click on this link, it takes me to Amazon. All right, it worked correctly. It was able to load and send me towards the actual website that I wanted. Now, there's a couple of attributes that I can pass into this, such as target, and I can make it underscore blank. Now, by doing that, when I click on the link, you'll see that it opened it up in a separate tab. It still went to the correct website. It just did it on a different tab. All right, any questions regarding the anchor tag? Perfect. Next, we're going to go into HTML list. So now a list works as such. I'm going to go ahead and create, there are two types of lists. I apologize. I should start off with that. We have ordered list. And we have unordered list. If I scroll down to the bottom, we see that I have my ordered list tag, which is an OL, and I included 6 different list items. Well, those list items inside of an ordered list will be represented by the numbers 1 through 6. In an unordered list, each one of the items will be represented by a bullet point. All right, any questions regarding list? Okay, great. If there aren't any questions regarding list, let's cover some tables. Well, in order to make a table, I always forget this syntax, so I wrote it down in our notes here. So here's our table, right? You can start with the table and then describe table headers for each individual column. So let's start there. I'm gonna create a table. You'll see that this table is empty. Currently doesn't have anything. Well, I can have things such as table rows. And inside of my table rows, I can have table data. And let's say this is hello, and finally, goodbye. Well, now I have a table down below that says hello and goodbye. Maybe I can do one more. Let's do TD X-ray. So there's our table with 3 individual cells, 1 table row. Well, let's repeat that, right? Let's say I want 2 table rows or 3 table rows. Well, now I can see this box model starting to be created. All right, well, how do I add headers to the top? And it's something that my table will actually know this is a header. Well, I'm gonna do T head to signify that this specific column will hold my headers. I'm still gonna utilize a table row, but the difference here is I need to include a table header. I'm gonna say greeting. A table header of, I'm not sure what to do here. I'm just gonna pass the evening. And a table header of noun. So there we can see our table headers being enunciated at the very top. I have my actual table down below. Just like I have table head, well, I could do the same thing for this 3 rows. I can tab them in one more time. And instead of having table head, I can have a table body. This is the body of my table. Right, nothing changed, but now when another developer takes a look at my code, even though nothing changed, they can easily read this table, say, hey, these are the headers that are being designated to each individual row, and here is the body of the row. It's more of a syntactical sugar than anything. At the same time, just like everything, I can also have a footer. I can have a table row with 3 separate cells. So table data, there I'm gonna go ahead and say, here we go, one more table data again. And table data one more time. If I scroll down to the bottom, we can see that it says footer. And I'm actually curious, just like up above, we have TH. I wonder if we have a table F. We don't. All right. And that is it for tables. Does anyone have any questions regarding how to generate tables with pure HTML? Go for it, Momo.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can make the line for the table.
Make some lines?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like to look like real table.
Yeah, we definitely can. We'll be covering that in the second portion of our lecture once we start talking about CSS.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now HTML semantics, right? We made this whole mess of a template, but it doesn't really look like anything. So let's fix that. I'm actually going to comment out the majority of my body here. Oh, hello. And I'm going to, okay. Doesn't seem to like my commenting very much. Something must be being misread. And that is okay. All right. So since it doesn't like my commenting very much, I'm gonna move this file over. I'm gonna make a copy of index.html into demo.html. And then I'm just gonna change the current information that we have in index so that we don't have to worry about it. All right. So here we have our index.html one more time. I'm gonna have Amazon in here for my title. And let's try to mimic this box model that we've created. So mimicking this box model that I've created, that means I need a parent division. So I know that in order to divide this up, I'm going to need a header. And again, this is all syntactical sugar. It doesn't actually contain any meaningful information. Within my header, or aside from my header, I'm also going to need a main element where all of my information will be contained, and then my footer. All right, so there's my three things. All right, so let's take a look at Amazon.com. So here's my header, my consistency, and then I have my body, and at the very bottom, I have my footer. So I see that my footer consists of rows, or kind of a table more than anything, right? But we see a couple of rows there. So I'm going to do a division inside, and actually I'm not going to do this division. I'm just going to do a table. I'm going to make a table. Inside of this table, I'm going to have a couple of headers. And let's utilize a row again, where the TD will say contact, and then TD say number. And now let's actually generate a little bit of a table body. So there's my table body. I'm going to do 3 separate table rows with 2 table datas inside of them. All right, so there you go. We have 3 table rows with 2 table datas. I'm not going to actually fill these in with some valid information. We just know that it's supposed to be an example of what we have down here below. Okay, well, let's take a look at what we have so far. It doesn't seem like anything is rendering. Let's try to stop this port here, and let's try going live again. All right, there's our render. So we see our contact and our num. It's all flush to the top, but that's our footer. All right. The next thing that we have is on our header. Well, on our header, we should have a search bar with a couple of other information. And then we should have a nav bar. Okay, great. So let's break that down. Here's our header. My header is going to have a separate division where there will be an H1 element that says Amazon. Okay, aside from that, there should be a paragraph tag that holds an address. Then there should be a form. That form is not going to have any action as of right now. It's just going to have an input type text. With a placeholder of search Amazon. And I could continue on with the header, but that's starting to get a little bit too in depth. The next thing I'm going to cover is just my nav bar. All right, I want to have a nav bar that will contain maybe 6 different list items. So maybe it has a UL that contains 6 different list items. And each one of these are an anchor tag. And now when I create them, for every single one of these, I don't actually want them to have any sort of link. Oh. All right, and now let's take a look at what our file looks like. Oh, that's not it. There you go. We can see our header actually starting to be built out. So now we have our header and our footer. And before I continue on going, does anyone have any questions about anything I've done up to this point? Okay, great. If there are any questions, now that we have that information, I can start building my body. Well, my body, which is inside of main, should have two separate divisions. One that is a carousel, so I'm just going to do a marquee here. Not sure I need to specify these two attributes. I'm going to put some lorem ipsum in there to just show something moving from left to right. All right, so that's supposed to show my first division, which is going to be that carousel. And then finally, I have a separate division that's going to hold some cards. So now I'm going to go ahead and make a division times, let's go with 3 for now. That will hold 4 separate image tags. So there's my division with 4 separate image tags. For all of them that say source, I'm going to go ahead and just give them a false link. And there you go. Now when I take a look at my site, although it's currently empty because there's nothing currently there in this information, if I inspect it, we'll be able to see a template of inside of main where I have a division with a marquee and a separate division holding a couple of image sources. All right, that is it as far as HTML goes. The next portion of our lecture is going to go ahead and talk about CSS. Does anyone have any questions regarding our introduction to HTML and the different tags that we utilize to build this example? All right, if there aren't any questions, we're going to go ahead and take a 40-minute break. During that break, I would like everybody to tackle the assignment to-do list. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right, welcome back, everyone. Currently where we left off is we are trying to create a clone of the Amazon website to a certain extent. We have a couple of nav tags, a little bit of semantic. You can see I have some list items. I added this teapot image for all of the image tags that we had below, which we'll address here shortly. And at the very bottom, we have this contact and number information for our footer. But we can see how we're starting to build out our our site. Well, I say we can see it, but you know, if you really think about it, there's not much comparison between what I'm seeing here and what we have inside of our actual site, right? So how do I start styling things to make things look better? Well, that's where CSS comes in. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And inside of Cascading Style Sheets, what we do is we actually apply different styles to each individual element. And there's a couple of different ways of doing such a thing. So, for example, let's say we have, or actually, I think it was Murad that mentioned it. Murad mentions he wanted to see something around the table, right? I have a table, but it's not very visible where that table is located. Not even my footer. Well, if I take a look over here, my footer is purely black and it has white text inside of it. Well, how can I mimic that to just happen within my footer? Well, the first way that we're going to go over as far as how to apply style sheets or style, it's going to be the attribute style. Each element can have an attribute named style. So you can see there, I put style equals in quotation marks, and that automatically opens up a couple of different styles. I can ask for a background color to now be black. You'll see now that everything is black. And I can also ask for the color, which this is going to apply to my font color, to be Alice Blue. And there you go. Now I have my contact information. Now you'll see there's a bit of a weird thing going on here, right? If I take a look at my left and to my right hand side, or just all around my footer, there seems to be some sort of gap happening. Well, we'll be covering that here shortly, but let's just keep that in mind as we're working with our CSS. All right, so there you go. That's how you can apply style to a specific tag, utilizing the style attribute. Now, although this works, this isn't necessarily the best way to isolate information. Just like we learned in object-oriented programming, and pretty much in everything about programming that we've learned up to this point, isolating behavior is extremely important, because if we don't isolate specific behavior, if something goes wrong, it's a lot harder to find where that problem has risen, where the problem comes from. There we go. We'll go with that. Where the problem comes from, if we don't actually have it isolated into their own spots. Now, with that said, within my head, I can actually create something called a style tag. And my style tag will allow me to write style within for each one of my HTML elements. Now I'm putting it within my head. I could put it within my footer, but why would I want it inside of my head instead of my footer? Can anybody take a random guess?
Is it because if you put it in the
Go ahead, Daniel.
yeah, is it because if you put it in the footer, it would apply only to the footer? So if you put it in the head, it will apply everything from top to bottom.
Close, Mikhail.
Is it because the HTML loads from the top to the bottom?
Yeah, so HTML gets rendered on the browser from top to bottom. So we want to make sure that all of our styles are loaded before the rest of my HTML template gets loaded, right? That way I don't get a split second where all of my HTML skeleton renders, but there's no styling being applied. It's bad user experience. So now how can I actually grab any of these tags? For example, we currently have the image tag that's rendering an image that's obnoxiously huge. So how could I fix that? Well, I can grab elements by their actual selectors. So in this case, what I want to grab is the image tag. I can specify by placing img and then opening up a selection there. So now I can say that I want the height of my image tag to be 10 pixels. And I want the width of my image tag to also be 10 pixels. All right, so what's going to happen here? Let me try to crash this port. It seems to have gone bad. Run it again. All right, so nothing really happened. Looks like my image tag isn't changing, even though it's being applied within my style tag. I'm wondering why. Let's see. Well, that would do it. I put sty instead of style, so spelling is important. I'm gonna go ahead and put style on there. Okay, now it highlights it correctly, and there we go. We can see those image tags showing up. I placed it at 10 pixels, but that might be a little too small there. So let's go with 100 to try to fix our problem. All right, so there's our image tags. They're each at 100 pixels. I'm gonna shift them up to 200 so that we could see them a little better. All right, so there's our image tags. There you go. Now we're starting to see some rows happening. A little bit of division with display block. Okay, great. And I'm applying all of this information by selecting the element that I want to select, and then writing the actual styling that I want to apply to each image. There is a ton of different selectors that you can utilize as far as decorations go or styling goes. We're not going to be covering each one of them. Please feel free to look into them as to how they work. The next part that I want to talk to is going to be something called classes and IDs. Now, let's see, where could I do this? Let's do this with our nav bar. All right, so here we have our nav bar, and I have all of these list items. But I may have a different list item somewhere else. Well, now in my list items, since all of these are going to be nav links, maybe what I want to do is I can grab all of them and add an attribute named class. And here I'm going to say this is a nav link. All right. So let me go ahead and see if I have somewhere else where I have an LI. I don't, so I'm going to create one real quick for visual effect. So I'm going to have a new UL. It's going to be an LI item class, or actually, okay, so now we can see the difference. We have all of our classes, right? Let's go ahead and try to add some styling into that. So I'm going to grab my LI item, and I'm going to say that I want all LI items to have, let's say, a background color of gray. Now you can see that all of my LI items have gray, but one of them isn't a link. One of them is not part of my nav bar. Well, that's where classes come in, right? Even though I have all of them highlighted in gray, I can isolate these LI items by giving them a class. A class is specific to multiple elements. So how do I grab something by a class? Well, in order to grab something by a class, I can simply come down, do a period, and say this is a nav link. I believe that's the class that I gave it, was nav link. And I can say that for my background color of my nav links, I want them to remain transparent. So now my list item still has a background color of gray, but because I have a nav link where the background color is transparent, it turns back to transparent. Now, something important to note there is that a selector of a class will always be prioritized over a selector of an element tag. All right, so a class works over an element tag. Well, let's take this a step further. What other ways can I isolate it? Right, maybe this one takes me back to the home page. Well, I can also add an ID, and an ID specific because it's supposed to only apply to one element. And this ID could be home. So now what I can do is up top, grab home, utilizing the number sign. I think somebody told me what it's called. I think it's pound sign, right? So we can utilize the pound sign, place home next to it, and then I can change some of its styling. I can say I want my font size to be larger. Now we can see that first link has gotten bigger. I can say that I want the background color to be yellow, and that I want the color of the font to be red. Okay, now we can see that we have my red dot, a background color that's yellow, and a little bit of a larger text. An ID will be first in priority level, classes will fall as second, and elements will fall as third, as far as applying each individual style to an element. Does anyone have any questions over our different selector types that we can apply with CSS? Go for it, Danny.
So, do you have to have so if you're trying to use an ID, do you have to also put the class in it? Can you just put ID instead of having the class? If you get what I'm saying? So,
Yeah,
if you like,
I'm saying if I come down here and remove class,
yeah,
yeah, I could. Right, so I
is that
remove
recommended?
recommended. It kind of depends on what it is that you want it to do, right? So let's say, and sorry, this might fall into a little bit of the it depends kind of classification or the what ifs, right? But if my nav link had some sort of formatting that I wanted to also be sustained at all points, which, for example, let's have my background being transparent. Let's say that I also want there to be, let's say a border, and I want my border to be 1 pixel, black and solid, right? If I wanted to maintain that information, I could leave the class on there. But if the class didn't matter for that specific element that has that ID, I could always remove it. Does that make sense? It's just making it easier for me to not have to rewrite styling over and over again.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? I see something on the questions channel. Someone shared, oh, I see Connor's just adding on to the lecture as far as priority inside of the different selectors that we have. All right. So now that we've talked about our different selectors, how they're divided, and we can see how to apply a little bit of CSS, let's take our isolation a step further. Again, I don't necessarily want styling to happen within my sheet. As you can see now, we're already up to 122 lines of code. And when you're working with HTML specifically, I don't know what it is. 122 lines is a considerable amount of code to have to work with at this point already. So the more isolated I can have my behavior, the better. Well, my styling is something that I can divide and place in a separate file. So I can do this by creating a file named main.css. We'll see main.css being created. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take all of the contents of this style tag, and I'm going to place them inside of main.css. All right, so everything is inside of main.css, but all my styling is gone. All right, except for my inline style at the very bottom. That's maintained because it's happening inline. But all the styling that I did inside of the style tags is now gone. Well, how do I connect these two? How do I tell index HTML, hey, you got to take a look at this style sheet, and this is how you read it? Well, we do that through a tag named link. The link tag will take in a relationship, in which case I'll specify to the browser, this is a style sheet, so make sure you read it as CSS. I don't have to specify the type. It usually does that if you have the relationship of style sheet. The only other thing that I need is to tell it where does it find it. Well, you're going to find this inside of main.css. And now you can see that all of my styling has come back. It all appears. I have my images, I have my stuff. I'm able to work with my current information while having everything isolated in its own separate file. All of my styling is within a CSS file. And all index.html is doing is referencing that file to load any styles. All right, you can do this with Google Fonts. Google Fonts, if you want to grab a font from Google, it gives you a line of code that you can copy and paste into HTML templates so that you can grab each specific font from there. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding how to link a style sheet? All right, I don't see any questions, so let me go ahead and do a quick overview of what we were to cover today. Today we went over doc type, HTML, all of our separate structure tags. We covered our content tags, element tags. We went into HTML forms, anchor tags, list, images, tables, and a bit in semantics. We will not cover the script tag today. We'll be covering that later on this week. We then went into CSS. What is CSS? A couple of the basics as far as selectors and their hierarchy, and linking a CSS style sheet. The only thing left for us to talk about is going to be the box model, and we'll do that as we're designing our current project here. Does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that we covered today? Okay, great. If there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and continue styling this so that it looks like Amazon. So here we have Amazon. We kind of created this bottom part here, but the first thing that I want to talk about, that's not it. The first thing that I want to talk about is this gap that we're seeing on the outside. Where is that gap coming from? Well, in CSS, we have something called the box model that allows us to read everything pretty easily. So I'm going to start at the very top. Doc type doesn't have any styling, doesn't give me anything. That's strictly for the browser. I click on HTML, and on HTML, we can see that that tag is occupying is the entire width and height of my monitor. And now let's click on head. Head isn't occupying anything. And it's just saying auto. Well, there's nothing here. It never gets displayed. Let's see, I wonder what happens if I change that to display block. Well, it doesn't seem like it lets me change it at all. So let me add it there. It's a display block. Well, if I add it on display block, it still doesn't show me any content. All right. Well, let's take a look at the next one. Well, now my body exists. Let me take that off. And if I hover over my body seems to have a little bit of a margin, right? We see that yellow box on the outside. Well, that's telling me that there's a margin. And if I take a look at my display over here, I see the margin going all the way around. And I wonder if that's where this white space around that background black coming from. And it is. So how can I take that off? Can anybody guide me through the process of taking off this margin 8 pixels off my document? Go for it, Daniel.
Can you just make margin set to 0?
Okay. Where do I do that?
So on the CSS style sheet, you can just type we can do margin curly brackets. Oh no, you put the margin inside the curly bracket. No, you put the footer. You put the footer in place of margin. And then you would put margin in the curly brackets and make that set to 0. I'm correct.
All right, let's see. Margin 0. All right, let's take a look now. I'm going to open this back up. Well, there's still a margin there. Let me take a look at my footer to make sure that it grabbed my style. So there I can see that the margin is set to 0 for my footer. And my footer doesn't have a margin, right? We can see the outside there saying none, none, and padding. Well, where is this gold coming from then? I'm going to use the selector tool. And I can take a look at body. It looks like body has the margin. So how can I adjust to make sure that this margin goes away?
Then you can go to the body tag, and then you can rename it to body, and then try margin equals to 0 pixels.
All right, so now we have body at 0 pixels and margin at 0 pixels. And now that white space has gone away. Great. Awesome. So there you go. We have our contact list, right? It's working great. Now let's start going to the very top here. Now at the top, I have this Amazon with this address and this input bar. So let's take a look at what we're trying to mimic. Amazon, address, input bar, and a couple of different links that we're not going to worry about. All right, let's make that happen through some CSS. So here I have my index, here's my header, and I have a couple of divisions there. So I have one div that's holding Amazon address and my input bar. So I'm going to give it an ID of upper header. And then my nav bar, I'm going to give it an ID of nav bar. All right, so let's fix this really quick. So I have my upper header. Which looks like my display needs to be in display flex with justify content, space between, and width being 100% of its parent. Well, now if I take a look at my clone, well, we can see my clone has Amazon, my address, my space between. They're all a little messed up. So let me take a look here. So there's my space between. My alignment isn't the best. So let's fix that alignment there. We're going to say align item center. All right, that brings everything to the same level. And maybe space between isn't the right thing that I want. It pushes it too far out. Let's do space around. And there you go. There's my top bar. It's also one of those, it has that black color as well. So I'm going to actually grab my header and give it a background color of black. Okay, come back over to my site. There's my header with a background color of black. And let's give it a color for my text of Alice blue. And maybe black is a little bit too much. Maybe I want something with a little bit more light per se. Let's say nope, that's not doing it. All right, well, we're gonna leave it like that. I'm not sure what exactly the correct color spectrum is that we're looking for. But I think I heard a couple of chimes coming in, so somebody must have had a question at one point. Someone have a question? Go ahead, Mikhail.
Oh, you can actually like get the color from Amazon. If you like right click on it, you can select the color, right click and do inspect. Yeah, the color picker should pop up on there and you can select it. Oh,
The
oh,
color.
you're not using Firefox?
Sorry.
Yeah, if you right click on it, you can select the color picker and it copies it and you can paste it in the CSS and you get the color for it. But it works in Firefox. I don't know about that one.
So it probably doesn't give it to me here in Apple. That would be cool if it did. At least I'm not seeing it when I right click.
Yeah, it does it for me on Firefox. So
All right. Okay, great. Connor?
The way I get the color is I take a screenshot and then I throw it into Paint, use the color picker tool, and then see what the color is for that thing with the RGB values. I don't know if you have Paint in Apple or not.
Yeah, I would have to take a look at how to do it. But for now, I'm just gonna leave it like this. Maybe we could do something a little bit more darker. So, sorry, just
to jump in. If you're trying to figure out an exact color on your screen, there's a digital color meter on Apple is what you can use.
Digital color meter, where do I do that?
So
Oh,
hit
there's also the elements. If you just click on that arrow by elements over to the left, and then you click on the color, it is gonna pop up. If you scroll
there you
down,
go.
click on the color,
Ah.
and if you scroll down to styles over there,
All right.
styles. If you scroll down that panel, like scroll back up to the top of styles.
Right here.
Click on yeah, there it is.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. Copy.
Yeah, great catch. All right, so there's a couple of different ways that we can steal things from other people's websites, whether they're colors or animations. You can just grab their code as well. This is what we have so far, right? Here's our little mimic of the Amazon thing. Well, what about this bar down here? Well, if I take a look here, I'm gonna try to make this a little darker. There you go. We can see the nav bar is supposed to be implemented, but the nav bar has got to be a little lighter. All right, so I'm gonna take a look at the nav bar. The nav bar is lighter. So let's apply that information here. Gonna open up my ID selector to grab the nav bar. Gonna ask it to be in display flex. Again, I'm going to justify content, space around. I'm gonna set the color. Well, the color is already there. Maybe the only other thing that I really need to do is change the background color. And for the background color, let's start off with gray and then move from there. Maybe just something like that. Okay, so now we can see that happening there. But take a look at those links. I did displace, flex, and space around, but they're not falling in correctly. That's because I'm grabbing the wrong content. All right, so I'm currently grabbing my nav bar, but I never grabbed those actual list items. So let's fix that. My nav bar needs to have this information, but my nav bar dot, and I believe this is UL, should have the following. It looks like I did that wrong. I wonder if I do it this way. There you go. All right, so I grab my nav bar, the UL element within my nav bar. I am going to display flex and make my links. So there you go. I have a couple of links now showing up. My home link is still being highlighted. Looks a little bit different than what Amazon did, but we're working through it. All right, and now finally, let's create our row here. All right, so if I take a look at index.html, the next thing that we have is in our main, we have this division. This division then has its own separate div with a couple of cards. So it looks like we have a row. So here at the very top division, I'm going to give it the class of row. And I'm going to look for this specific syntax here to give it the class of card. All right. So now for my row, I'm going to display flex. Okay, great. So now there we see we have a couple of rows, it looks like. Actually, I think it's just one row, but there's just too many images. And now let's take a look at our cards here. Let's do a border that has 1 pixel, black, and solid. All right, so there's my row with one specific card at each one. And each one of these cards has 4 images. Good. Well, how do I make them fall into place? Well, this card, I likely want it to be in display flex. And I want to flex wrap to apply with. All right. So almost there. All right, if I were to open this all the way up, we'll likely see them wrap up a little bit. So there you go. Now I have Amazon with I'm a link working each one of them. We have this marquise that's supposed to symbolize the actual carousel, and then a card with 4 images inside of it. All right, making an actual clone would take a considerable amount of more time, but we can see how we're starting to mimic and generate the skeleton that Amazon is rendering on their site on our own project. Does anyone have any questions regarding anything that was covered today or anything regarding the demonstration? All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.